Hello, and welcome inside my chewy head. What kind of person gets locked up in a mental hospital? Someone violent, unpredictable, dangerous? What does it take to end up on an acute psychiatric ward? And if you did, would you ever tell anyone about it? This podcast is about dispelling myths, fear, and stigma surrounding mental health from my own personal experience as a patient. Hello, we meet again on the Chewy Head podcast, and it's lovely to have you back. Today I'm talking about Susan and Roy, and I'm talking about them both together because they were kind of always together. They were always a pair, and they were also the two people that I was probably closest to in hospital. And as I mentioned at the end of last week's episode, this is quite a difficult one for me to talk about, but I'll do my best. So we'll start with Susan, just purely because I met her first. I met her kind of immediately on my first day in hospital because it was her first day as well. And I can remember lying on my bed and I could overhear her having this conversation with someone on the phone. And she was saying like, oh, I don't know, I literally just arrived, I don't have a clue, I'm in a dormitory. And the way she was talking to this person reflected how I was feeling in terms of just having no idea where the hell I was and feeling confused and feeling quite isolated. And she also seemed comparatively normal. I use that word in air quotes, which I love to use on this podcast. Never in real life, I promise. If you ever meet me or if you have met me, you'll know that. But anyway, but she seemed kind of quite grounded and someone that I could have a rational conversation with. So I plucked up the courage and introduced myself, seeing as I thought, Christ, we're sharing a bedroom for the foreseeable future. We might as well get to know each other. So we had a brief conversation and she kind of explained that she'd arrived on the same day that I had and that this wasn't her first time in hospital. She'd been in hospital earlier that same year. In fact, basically my breakdown obviously occurred in August and her situation began in July, and by this point it was early October, and so she'd already done a stint in hospital, a short stint, and then come out and now returned. And essentially before that she'd never had any issues with mental health, but she'd gone through some form of mental health crisis and had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had lost the place in which she was living. She had a child, she had a partner, and unfortunately, because of the situation, she actually lost her accommodation and had to move in with her parents. So her child was living with her elderly parents because she was, as I say, in her 40s. And so her parents were a bit older and they were struggling to cope with her essentially, which really, really made her feel horrendous and full of conflicted feelings of kind of guilt and shame and all sorts of horrible negative things like that. None of which was her fault, but obviously she didn't want to impose herself onto her parents. But her situation was really difficult because she was in a position where she could not move back in with her parents, but she didn't have anywhere else to go in terms of if she was released from hospital, she wouldn't have a place to go to, which made her stay in hospital quite difficult and also made her stay in hospital longer than perhaps it would have been otherwise, which is potentially why I got to know her, because obviously I was in hospital for an extended period of time and she and I shared a dormitory for part of that time. And that's why I know so much about her journey and a little bit about her as a person. I met Roy again, probably the same day. Him and Susan had already become friends by that point, or had talked. Probably not friends because they'd just met each other. Christ, I don't know. I don't know how other people interact in terms of their friendship timescales, so I won't comment on that. But anyway, they'd become acquainted, shall we say? And we had dinner together that night, and that makes it sound far more formal and pre-arranged than it actually was, because obviously you were in a dining room. There were like essentially long picnic tables and you had to sit somewhere, didn't you? And to be honest with you, when I first arrived, I was like, I'm just going to sit on my own. I don't actually want to interact with anyone. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be alive. I just felt utter despair. Definitely didn't want to reach out to anyone. However, because obviously there are a limited number of places to sit and there are a large number of patients, you have to cohabit a table. So I was fortunate enough that pretty much from that night onwards, we always ate dinner together. We always had breakfast together in the morning. We just got into a routine of always having our meals together. And so as a result of that, we got to know each other a bit. We got to know about each other's stories. So as I say, Susan was bipolar, or she'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. However, the way she presented to me, as I've said, was very level and very rational. And in comparison to other people that I met who were diagnosed with bipolar, she seemed really quite stable. So I met people both at that time and later on in my time in hospital who were very, very clearly manic or very, very clearly depressed. And I'm not saying that she wasn't bipolar, because I am definitely not a medical professional and able to say anything about that. But she was far more interactive and approachable than potentially someone who was experiencing a severe high or a severe low might have been, from my experience, that is. The only indication that I had that she was bipolar, the only experience personally that I had of symptoms potentially of bipolar was, I was very fortunate in hospital in that compared to a lot of patients, I had quite a lot of visitors. And I'm not saying that to be boastful, because I'm incredibly grateful to every single person who came to visit me during my time in hospital. You'll never know how much that meant to me in terms of making me feel like a normal human being rather than a creature in a cage. It meant the world to me that people would drive all that way to see me, because I didn't really live anywhere near where my hospital was. And I had family members who drove up. I mean, I've got a brother who lives right down south, and he drove all the way up to see me. And again, I've got friends who would come after work, and they would come every week. And that was really, really, it meant the world to me. And I think things like this really show you who your friends are. And I really learned who my friends are. And I'm so grateful for them. So if they're listening, thanks for being great friends. But I'm not trying to say that to be boastful, and I hope that comes across. But that meant that sometimes I wasn't on the ward because I was allowed out with another person at this stage anyway. Later on that changed, but at this stage I was allowed out. And so I would be in the family room, which wasn't on the ward, it was slightly off the ward, or I would be in the hospital canteen or whatever. And I came back one day and the door to the ladies' dormitory was broken. It was standing off. And as I've said previously, that door was locked and could only be accessed via a staff member. And I was like, oh, this is weird. And then I saw Susan. And obviously, anytime I saw Susan, I would go to her and she'd give me updates on what I'd missed while I'd been off the ward. And there was always something. Something always had happened. There was never a dull moment on that ward, honestly. Anyway, I was like, oh, the door's broken off. Why is that? She was like, oh, that was me. I was like, what? Because she was just like a little 40-year-old woman. I didn't really think that she would have been capable, because it was a mechanized door, obviously, because they didn't want people accessing it who weren't allowed to, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't have been locked. Well done, Ellie. But anyway, and I was like, oh, right, what happened? She was like, oh, I was just really, really angry because they wound me up because I told them I didn't want to speak to them and I wanted to have my medication at a certain time and they wouldn't let me and I got angry. And so I broke the door because I wanted to get away from them because they kept trying to speak to me. And I was like, oh, right. Oh, fair enough. And it was just small incidents like that which made me think, oh, okay. Just as she probably had many times when she saw me try and kill myself or cut myself or whatever, where she thought, oh, right, maybe that's why Ellie's in here. Or maybe it was far more obvious with me. I don't know. Obviously, being me, it's difficult to say. But for me, as I say, she seemed really quite level and stable, other than that one occurrence. And then later on, she had a few more incidences where she got very, very angry. But they were mainly because in a ward round, she would be told that she couldn't leave. And she would say, okay, but at the same time, I don't need to be here in terms of there's no more treatment that you can provide for me because I'm on the medication. That's quite clearly working because I'm not manic and I'm not really low. But because she didn't have anywhere to live and they were working with, I think it was Framework, who are like a homeless charity, to find her somewhere to live because she was essentially homeless, apart from obviously her parents, who she did not want to impose herself upon. Fair enough. And so she would get very frustrated with this situation, especially with the psychiatrists who, I mean, again, potentially I have a very negative and clouded perspective of psychiatry, given the fact that I was under the power of psychiatrists for 3 months. But I could appreciate that it was frustrating at times because often they would come from this kind of superior, I know better than you about yourself approach. And that could be really difficult as a pill to swallow, which is, by the way, all they were offering as well, which again was a very bitter pill. So, pun intended there, definitely. Eventually, what happened with Susan was that around the same time that I was being moved, she was offered a place at a halfway house for people with mental health conditions. So, really, really rare, very limited places. I think there are literally only about 6 places. And essentially, this is like semi freedom, I think. And because she was able to have this address, that was hopefully a stepping stone for her to move on and pursue whatever it was that she wanted to pursue in terms of accommodation or work or whatever. So that was a really positive step for her, and she was really, really happy about that. But she'd had several times before that where she'd been told, right, okay, you'll be being moved on this day. And she'd packed up her stuff and then she'd been waiting and she'd said, sorry, when am I moving? When am I going? And they turned around and said, no, you're not going. You're not going today. And then as a result of that, she had become very, very angry. And as a result of that, started shouting and swearing and all the rest of it, which might seem like an extreme reaction. But until you have personally been in a position in which your freedom has been taken away from you and you are not allowed to do what you want with your life, essentially, you're not allowed to choose which physical room that you're in. You're not allowed to choose what you eat for dinner. You're not allowed to choose who you see and when you see them. You're not allowed to choose even what time that you go to bed. Like when those choices are taken away from you and you have no idea about when you might get those choices back, you can feel very angry. And so, although I did appreciate that that might be more extreme than potentially other people might have reacted in that situation, I understood why she reacted the way she did. But yeah, so that was Susan. In terms of her being excellent material for discussing a specific mental health condition, I wouldn't say that she was really a good demonstration of that. But what she was a friend. And she was a friend when I needed a friend, and a friend who was available during a very difficult time in hospital. Um, so yeah, alongside her was Roy. Roy was in hospital for the same reason that I was, essentially, because he tried to kill himself. And he was different to me in that he was suffering from a lot of physical pain. And as a result of the physical pain that he was in, he couldn't see a future for himself because the chronic pain was too much for him to bear on a daily basis. So that was why he'd made an attempt on his life and ended up in hospital. But really interestingly, with Roy, he was always the one making jokes and laughing. And again, he just came across as someone who was really stable and really level and really funny and kind and generous, and someone that you would go to if you had a problem or you wanted to air a grievance on the ward. He didn't come across as someone who was in a pit of despair, which is probably how he really was feeling, given that obviously that was how I was feeling at the time. And again, I don't know if I came across similarly to him in that we didn't sit there and go, oh, isn't life shit? Yeah, I want to kill myself. Do you? Yeah, I do. It wasn't like that. It was more like, oh, have you seen what so and so's done? Or I don't know, taking the mick out of a healthcare assistant or something. Just silly stuff like that that we would do to pass the time, because what else is there really to do? And him and Susan were definitely closer than I was to either of them, just because, as I say, I was quite fortunate in that I had quite a few visitors and they less so. Not because I'm not saying because they had less friends or anything like that, but I think just practically people found it more difficult to get to them quite as frequently. They did have visitors. I'm not saying they didn't have any visitors, but they used to, when they were able to, they would go off the ward together and have a cigarette or whatever. And I didn't smoke. And if they were on the ward, they would be together and I might be off the ward. And so they were definitely very close. So I returned from my 2-night break from the ward, or however you want to put it, my failure to make it on the outside. And I was filled with even more despair and even more confusion about, because on the one hand, I had been convinced that I shouldn't have come home and I should be dead, convinced of that, to the point where, it's almost like if someone told you that gravity didn't exist anymore and you knew that gravity did exist, it was that sort of depth of knowledge that I had about that feeling. And I suppose unless you've had that feeling, it's difficult really to understand that. But that's the only example I can give you. It's like a knowledge that nobody else can dissuade you of. And to be honest, if other people try and dissuade you of that, like if someone was telling you today, "Oh, gravity's not real. Don't believe in gravity," you would start questioning that person's sanity. But anyway, so yes, so I came back to the ward and Susan and Roy were both still there. Obviously, Susan stayed for much longer than Roy, actually. So about 2 weeks after I returned, it was a Monday, and Monday, as I have said previously, was a culling day, because honestly, it was like you would arrive on a Monday afternoon, or you'd come back to the ward on a Monday afternoon, or do you know what? You'd look around at dinner on a Monday afternoon and you'd think, because by the way, dinner wasn't at, a reasonable hour. I think it was at 5 o'clock. Who in their right minds eats dinner at 5 o'clock? I don't know. If you do, that's fine. But I certainly didn't, and I found it weird anyway. You'd look around and you think, where the hell is so and so? Where's so and so? And sometimes you think, thank God so and so has gone. I remember there was this one lady who was incredibly violent and aggressive. Fortunately, she wasn't in my dormitory, and she spent most of her time in bed. But if she wasn't in bed, she would be at dinner. And she was schizophrenic, and she was convinced that there was a voice telling her that her children were being murdered. And she would also think that you were looking at her when you weren't, you were just getting on with your meal. And I happened to once be the target of this, where she was like, "What the fuck are you looking at? Why are you looking at me?" So, all of this, I was thinking, oh dear, I am not prepared for this sort of level of violence and abuse. And I suppose that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because although I didn't care about myself and I was quite happy to hurt myself and I was quite happy to make attempts on my life, I still was concerned and physically afraid of pain, I suppose. So the idea that she might attack me, which, isn't that far away from being verbally abusive potentially, was still a scary prospect to me, which is interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? But I suppose that's the thing about mental health. If it was logical, then it would be logically resolved. And unfortunately, it's often tied with our emotions. Some would argue it's tied with your brain chemistry. And therefore, it's not just a logical thing at all, which is why I think people who are quite strictly logical in their ways of thinking, perhaps because they're in denial of their own mental health needs, because everybody has physical health and everybody has mental health. And there is nothing more frustrating to someone who is suffering from an acute mental health disorder or illness than to hear that, oh, you're one of those people who has mental health problems, or, no, we all have moments in our lives where we have an awareness or a heightened need for support with our mental health. That's completely normal and part of being a human being. And if you are in denial of that, then you are probably not in a great mental space, from my own opinion, as someone who was quite adamant that I had great mental health and there was nothing wrong with me, and I could just act like a machine and be a robot and not have emotions and feelings. And if anything upset me, I could just take it out on myself essentially by working harder and being better, which really didn't work out well for me. So if you are coming from a perspective of thinking, like I did, that your mental health isn't something that you're ever going to need to address, you're making a huge assumption about yourself as a human being going through the chaos and uncertainty of everyday life. You really are. And I had a very rude awakening by being committed to hospital, and by being sectioned as I was later, and by being further sectioned as I was later, and having control taken away from me. I never thought that that would happen to me. Nobody in that hospital probably grew up thinking I will end up spending my life in and out of hospital, as some people sadly do on those wards, but they did. Anyway, I'm digressing here. Roy was suddenly told one Monday, he wasn't expecting it, or he didn't tell me that he was expecting it. And obviously, we spoke every day, me, him, and Susan. But he was cold, essentially. And the reason why it was quite confusing and abrupt was that he hadn't received, because obviously, as I've said, Roy suffered from chronic pain due to a pre-existing health condition, which was the reason why he struggled with the notion of wanting to be alive. Because who wants to live in pain? Absolutely no one. Who wants to feel that they can't be the best version of themselves because of the way in which their body is reacting to the world? Nobody wants to feel like that. If you're in physical pain, you're probably much more likely to be in emotional pain as well. So he was waiting for the hospital to put him in touch with, apparently they have something called a pain management team. In my head, this is like a group of people with like massive hypodermic needles who just go around anaesthetizing people. I'm sure it's not like that. But he hadn't heard from them. He'd not been connected with that service at all. But they released him. And when you're released from hospital, or discharged is probably the correct term, they normally give you leave, or they make a decision then and there. I'm pretty sure that Roy was given a week's leave. So he had a week's leave, and then he was discharged. And I remember him coming back onto the ward, maybe he didn't ever have a whole week even. I honestly I couldn't tell you exactly the dates, but I know that he came back onto the ward for his final ward round meeting, and that was one of the last times. Well, that was the last time that I ever saw him. Um, so when he came back onto the ward, he was with his wife, and at that point I realised that I knew this woman and we had actually worked together previously. And I was like, oh my goodness. And she is absolutely lovely and was so kind and wanted to ask me how I was and wanted for me to get better, I suppose. Or I know I've used that term again, which I despise, but recover, or however you want to phrase it, resume a better state of mental health. Resume a better state of mental health, as if I had really good mental health before I went into hospital. Obviously, I didn't. Anyway, so I remember Roy seeming quite happy, but he always seemed happy. So it wasn't unusual for him to put on a front. And I do think he must have been putting on a front because he, as I've said, he didn't talk about his feelings or his, well, he did. Like, he did occasionally say, like, oh, I wanted to kill myself because I don't want to live in pain anymore. But he said it like that, like very factual rather than being emotional at all. And this is hard to talk about because um, I just assumed that things were going well for Roy because obviously he left hospital, he was discharged. Things must have been going well for him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been released, you know. And when you're still in hospital, you have limited contact with people and you just kind of wish them well. And people come and go. And that's just, you kind of accept that you're living in this constant flux of people arriving on the ward and then people leaving the ward and whatever. So I left hospital and was finally discharged, not from that hospital, but from another hospital, as I've said. And essentially, about a couple of weeks after I was discharged from hospital, I bumped into Roy's wife in the supermarket. And I was like, oh, hi, how are you and stuff. And she was like, oh, I'm so pleased to see you out. I've thought about you so much and stuff. And I said, and how is Roy? And she said, um, sorry, she said that Roy ha- is dead. He's passed away. So about literally a few days after I think it might have even been 2 days after he left hospital, they went to sleep together on the sofa and he did not wake up. Um, and and that was really hard for me to hear because I knew that that could quite easily have been me. And I don't know why that wasn't me. Like, obviously I know that I'm not married to his wife and I know that I'm not going to fall asleep with her on a sofa, but in terms of like being in a position where you don't want to live anymore and you can't see there ever being a time when you do, and somehow finding some form of like a desire to live, as I have done sometimes, it's very difficult to think that someone that you knew who had the same sense of despair is dead. And I can't tell you how hard it is to know that and to know that because he had a family, he had children, but even if he didn't, it's more about the fact that he's a human being and he was a human being who was in pain and he was a human being who needed support and needed help. And he thought he was going to get help in hospital, as we all do when we first go in. That's the one thing you cling to when you're in hospital. Well, hopefully things will be better. And things didn't get better for him. And he was still waiting for pain management when he passed away. How is that? How is that right? How is that fair? How is that? How does that happen? And if I think about it too much, I just get drawn into this like web of confusion because I find it so confusing and so desperately sad. Because it is sad because he was a person, a lovely, lovely man, and he's no longer with us. And that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about these things, because I think if you don't talk about something, it becomes something that you conceal and festers and taints you and corrupts you essentially. And it might not be something you're consciously aware of, but it is there. It is there. And I also feel that because I haven't killed myself, and because I am still alive, and because he has passed away, I sort of feel that I have to live for him now. And I don't mean like literally, obviously, but I just mean that when I'm in my pit of despair, I think of him sometimes and think that he will never see another day. He will never see his wife again. He will never see his kids again. And conversely, they'll never see him again. And I don't, you know, it's difficult to put into words, to be honest, how that feels to know that I'm here and he's not here, and that isn't unusual, and that depression kills so many people. So many people. So that's their story. So what did I learn from them? And so I learned that essentially on a mental health unit is bearable when you have people that you can talk to and who can understand. Because as much as I am so grateful for the people who came and visited me and who sent me messages and supported me and all the rest of it, unless it happens to you, you can't really appreciate how it feels. And so that's why having people that you can talk to about things that you might not want to talk to people outside of the ward about is so important. And just having an opportunity to air something which is probably nothing and probably isn't, like if you've had to wait for an hour for your medication, or you've had to wait 10 minutes standing outside a door for somebody to open that door, and no one cares about that. No one cares, because why would anyone care? It's not really that important, is it? But what that does to you inside is makes you feel so small and so insignificant and so low. And you're already feeling low, and you're already feeling neglected and helpless and vulnerable. And it just reminds you of that. Those small things are reminders that you are not a human being in the same way that you were before you were a patient. And to have other people who are experiencing that as well and are able to empathize with you on the same level, because they know exactly what that's like, is so, so important. And so I suppose I learned that from them. And I think I'm still kind of processing it all, to be honest. I suppose I've learned that I'm lucky. I'm so lucky. I'm lucky to have known those people. And I'm lucky that I'm alive. I'm lucky. In terms of what you can learn that depression is the largest killer of any illness right now. It is the single greatest cause of death for people in the UK right now. It's not cancer, it's not heart disease, it's not diabetes or any of those things that you might think it is. And that I'm not suggesting that those things aren't desperately sad and difficult and complex. Of course they are. But I'm suggesting that people seem to think that depression is something that you go to the doctor about, they give you a pill and you feel better and you perk up. And the reality is that people die from depression. Every single day people die. People die in their teens, and that's not okay. It's not okay. And on that rather passionate and depressing, should I say, note, I decided to step down from my soapbox and end this podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening, as usual. I would love it if you would subscribe to this podcast, firstly, and secondly, follow me on social media so that we can have a beautiful space in which to engage in a conversation about mental health. So all of my social media links are down below. And if you'd like to, you could even give this podcast a review, which would obviously be 5 stars because of my fragile mental health. That's a joke, obviously. I'm not trying to emotionally blackmail anyone. Join me this time next week on Chewy Tuesday. It's still there and it's still good, when I will be sharing with you the latest episode, which will this time be slightly more positive
and will be about a very, very interesting young lady who we shall call Stephanie.